We have very different systems, the United States and China, but we actually have a great deal of interdependence so that we know that the only thing that would be worse than China succeeding would be China failing.
As we see decoupling take place, we're seeing markets that are literally bifurcating. There'll be an East and a West market for certain goods and services. There'll be competition between the East and the West, the U.S. and China, and its allies in both cases, that'll take place.
Welcome to Living Beyond Borders, the podcast from Citi Private Bank and GZERO Media that examines the risks and opportunities in our rapidly changing world, from global politics to economics and what it all means for you. I'm Caitlin Dean, head of the Financial and Professional Services practice at Eurasia Group. And odds are, either you or your kids have heard some of these before.
How to get any girl's attention at a party. Quick glance, smile, look at a friend, take a drink, look away, and bring them back.
Okay, I'm bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. Bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. I'm bored.
Chicken wing, hot dog and bologna, chicken and macaroni, chilling with my homies.
Those are videos that have gone viral on TikTok, the China-based social media platform that allows users to make and share short videos. As it turns out, TikTok became a big geopolitical flashpoint this year. Back in August, President Trump issued an executive order demanding that TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, sell off its U.S. operation. He cited security concerns over the company sharing data with the Chinese government. TikTok is just the tip of the iceberg for the issue we're going to talk about today. Have you heard of Didi? That's a ride-sharing service like Uber. And Renren is kind of like Facebook. Of course, there's Alibaba, an Amazon alternative. All of them come from China. And if those companies and the Chinese government have their way, you may see them in a lot more countries soon. Henry Kissinger said the US and China are at the foothills of a new Cold War. If that's true, the smartphone in your hand might become a weapon on the front line. Let's talk about it. I'm joined now by Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and David Bailin, chief investment officer at Citi Private Bank. Hello, Ian and David. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Pleasure to join you today.
Ian, let's start by defining the term decoupling. Can you give our listeners a brief sense of what that actually means and where the two nations are in the process?
Well, when we think about globalization, which is the primary driver of the growth in the global economy over the past decades, we're talking about goods and services and people and capital and ideas and data moving faster and faster across borders around the world, and particularly tying together the world's two largest economies, the United States and China. It's not like the Americans and the Soviets, where we were fighting each other and we did very little business together. We have very different systems, the United States and China, but we actually have a great deal of interdependence so that we know that the only thing that would be worse than China succeeding would be China failing. And the Chinese ultimately feel the same about the United States. A process of decoupling is one by which that interdependence starts to be proactively undone. And so there is less win-win and more zero-sumness. And so when you, for example, you have sectors where the Chinese can't invest in the US and where the Americans can't invest in China, or if you cut off travel between the two countries, you cut off media coverage between the two countries, anything you do that erodes that interdependence is part and parcel of this process of decoupling.
And while this is something that, we've heard more and more about in the recent past, this isn't a split that just started recently. This has been years in the making, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. Decoupling is something we've seen for a long time, in part because the presumption in the West that the Chinese, as they got larger and wealthier, that they would align with the West, that they would politically liberalize and they would become a free market. And therefore, they would open their markets automatically in a transparent way to the West. That hasn't happened. And so, for example, you look at well before coronavirus, well before President Trump, you had some of the most important American technology firms that just did not have access into China. Facebook, for example, Amazon, Twitter, for example, Wikipedia. So that was already creating some decoupling. And so too, the fact that Chinese labor was getting comparatively more expensive meant that you had some firms that weren't necessarily bringing a lot of labor back to the United States, but were thinking about cheaper places. So Vietnam's explosion in growth has come in part because some lower level manufacturing and increasingly higher level manufacturing has shifted from China to Vietnam. And that's happening in many places, particularly in Southeast and South Asia.
David, what are some of the economic implications we've seen around decoupling?
So the economic implications of decoupling have a lot to do with what's available, what services and goods are actually available in what parts of the world. That clearly is changing. And then we actually have the intel inside of those things. What are they made of? How are those components put together? And where do those components come from? And as we see decoupling take place, we're seeing markets that are literally bifurcating. There'll be an East and a West market for certain goods and services. There'll be competition, between the East and the West, the U.S. and China, and its allies in both cases. That'll take place. It's going to make goods and services more expensive initially. Second of all, it's going to create firms that don't have common interests competing, and that means that they're going to lack common standards. A good example of that is the internet itself. Free access to information in one market, heavily restricted access to information in another market. One level of surveillance and privacy in one market, a different level of perceived privacy and surveillance in another market. And the economic trade-offs for that happen to be around what Ian talked about, which is data. To the extent that a government or a business is happy to share the information and data associated with its business and sees that transparency to data and its relationship to China as really not threatening, that could be an advantage in terms of getting cheaper goods and services in that marketplace. And similarly, if you think about the need to maintain privacy or to have a different type of internet, you might be willing to pay more or do different things to protect your assets in a market that is open.
Ian, what are some of the potential impacts on things like research, healthcare, and education?
Well, when you think about data, as David was saying, you're not just talking about your smartphone and digital commerce. You're also increasingly talking about the future of research and healthcare and education and even agriculture, right? I mean, the efficiencies that are being driven in all of these fields, especially in the pandemic era, when people are in their homes and socially distant, but you still need to get your kids to school and you still need to be able to see your doctor. And that means applications. That means data. That data is going to be collected. It's going to be surveilled. There's going to be advertising that's sold against it. It's going to be commercialized. And so as you think about a decoupling in data, you're not just talking about the small number of super firms. You're increasingly sort of digging much deeper into the economy. You're splitting apart the way a lot of different sectors work that had been increasingly globalized. You're changing the trajectory on that. And you're also splitting apart human beings. You're saying that depending on which set of applications you are attached to, that actually determines who else on the planet you'll be connected to. And increasingly, that's going to have geopolitical overtones as decoupling continues.
David, what could decoupling mean to average consumers, whether they're here in the U.S. or elsewhere around the world?
Well, let's talk about consumption in a few different ways. We always think of them as, things that we buy, hard goods, phones and things like that. But following on to Ian's point and looking specifically at healthcare, let's take a look at the pandemic and the vaccine. And right now you have a race to produce a vaccine in the United States, in Europe, China, and in Russia. But when it comes to talking about the cooperation that one would normally see in scientific research and scientific endeavors for the benefit of greater humanity, you're seeing the opposite. You're seeing a decoupling and a competition, even in the production of the vaccine for the virus. And so this to me is when we talk about the impact on the consumer, let's talk about the impact on humanity. And I think that's a real loss. And that loss is going to be seen in many places, associated with climate change, associated with fundamental sharing of sciences that can benefit humanity, whether it's from clean water to agriculture. And so when I talk about the idea of higher costs, as I did earlier, I'm referring to a physical higher cost, that things will cost more monetarily, but that there is also a cost socially that is well beyond profits and losses.
Let's examine Henry Kissinger's comment that we're in the foothills of a new Cold War. Is this a new Cold War, and what does that mean, if so?
I don't think we are, in the sense that there is still an enormous amount of interdependence between the U.S. and China. We still benefit from the Chinese economy not falling apart. The Chinese still benefit for the United States not only having a robust economy, but also continuing to provide some level of stability through our troops in the Middle East, for example, and NATO, for example, and other places. Very different from the old U.S.-Soviet relationship, very different from the present-day U.S.-Russia relationship, for example. But there is a technology Cold War. It's real. There are Chinese national champions like Huawei, for example, in technology, their most important tech company, that the United States is trying to actively hinder. Indeed, I don't think we've said this publicly, but I think it's pretty clear that we'd like them to fail. We'd like them to not be an operating concern in the next, say, 5 years. We want Western technology to be dominant, functionally displace China as an emerging technology superpower. And that has really significant implications. It doesn't mean that Chinese students won't study in the U.S. anymore and pay full freight in their tuition. Doesn't mean that if you go to a Walmart in 5 years, you won't still be buying a lot of Chinese manufactured goods. So those things would happen if there was a Cold War. But it does mean the most important sort of new and innovative sector in the global economy is increasingly in a combative and very non-globalization orientation. And that's going to cause both a lot of conflict, and it's also going to drive a lot of inefficiency. I think that there are companies like Amazon that will increasingly become national champions, patriotic institutions for the United States, in many ways mirror imaging the way the Chinese have set up their technology sector in the past decade.
When you think about what a Cold War is, right? It's a state, of hostility, whether it's political hostility, military hostility that exists. It's full of things like propaganda, sanctions, threats, and so when you look at the conduct of the two countries today, as it's being done, I do think it very much feels like what we experienced before in a Cold War with Russia. But what's going on now in terms of the activities that are taking place between Xi and Trump today doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the nature of what the relationship is in the future. And so I think we have to think more broadly about that. If President Trump is reelected, then one can imagine a continuity of what I would describe are Cold War actions, on the part of the U.S. and China towards one another. But if Biden were to actually win, then it could create even greater competition with China, right? Because he would probably realign the U.S. with European allies. So when we think of the Cold War from what Kissinger was experiencing, literally, it could go that way for the next 4 years if Trump is reelected, President Trump is reelected, but it also could go a very different way. A different type of, quote, war?
I think it's very clear that right now, the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship is negative in every aspect of it, whether you're talking about the World Health Organization and the vaccines that are being developed and culpability for the original outbreak of coronavirus, to trade and intellectual property, to technology and data and cyber and artificial intelligence, to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, to the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Uyghurs, Tibet. I mean, it is a pretty long list It's interesting that while the foreign policy orientations of Biden and Trump towards China are broadly similar, I mean, they generally agree that the U.S. needs to take a harder line towards China on pretty much all of these issues. But the way that they would go about it is actually very different. So to the extent that a Cold War were possible, you kind of blunder into it. It's like a hot war. It's very rare in history that you have two countries that actually plot out strategically, here is how we're going to get into a war with our major antagonist. Rather, it's a lot of miscalculations, bluster that you expect the other side will back away from, messaging that you think you're sending but that they're not receiving properly. And that has become more dangerous in the last couple of years of the Trump administration. And I agree with David. That's one where the outcome of this election will matter.
Just continuing for a little bit on this idea of the Cold War, this comparison with the Cold War several decades ago, David, unlike the Soviet Union, China has real resources. It's the second largest economy in the world. So how does that change the equation as well?
Well, you're right. They could not be more distinct from one another. China now has developed so rapidly and brought so many people out of poverty that its own internal economy in the course of just 30 years is now the most important aspect of how it's going to perform in the future. We estimated that less than 4% of its GDP has anything to do with the United States now in terms of actual trade. And given that, they are extraordinarily different. So if we think about what that means, there is no way that there won't be interdependence, political dialogue, economic relationship between these two countries. So when we think about this, and we think about markets, and we think about the economy in terms of a stock market or investments, China is infinitely more important than Russia. So for portfolios, right, when we think about investing, we think about being able to identify companies with significant growth prospects, revenue and profit growth prospects, that can stake out dominant positions in their relative industries and compete globally. Russia has virtually none of them. And China has literally one or more in every single sector. Some of them are behind the U.S. and the West, but many of them are on par. And so China is, number one, here to stay, will become the largest economy in the world, and is taking steps right now to ensure that it has its own set of capital markets, which is one of the reasons why it took the steps it did in Hong Kong, to gain access to capital to allow that to be the case. So when we think about a Cold War, largely political, not really significantly economic, here what we're talking about is very intense competition that will last for, who knows, 50, 100 years, whatever, but a very, very long time. And they'll be competing for capital, for market share, for dominance in industries. And ultimately, if that is peaceful, that could be pretty extraordinary for what it could do for humanity. If it is not peaceful, or it could be extraordinarily expensive in some of the ways that we've talked about.
So I want to continue on that point and talk to both of you a bit about how this competition and the decoupling will impact the rest of the world. So, will it be harder for other nations' companies to find their place? Will other nations need to choose sides?
Let me give you an example. I've been talking to the Japanese leadership a lot in the last few days. As you know, Prime Minister Abe's not there for much longer. He's going to be replaced by the former Chief Cabinet Secretary, Suga. And Abe has a long-lasting Japanese prime minister, the longest in modern-day history, and also very oriented towards foreign affairs with a very strong relationship with President Trump. That won't be true of Suga. And it's going to be more difficult for the Japanese to continue to balance between a strong economic relationship with China and a strong cyber and technology and security relationship with the United States. I think about TikTok here in the US and how Microsoft was trying to buy it. And Oracle says they're going to do a partnership. And the difference, of course, is that Microsoft doesn't have a very strong, lean personal relationship with Trump, and the Oracle CEO does. So they think they can maybe cut a better deal and they can get away with more hedging. That's kind of like Abe and Suga. It's going to be harder for them. And I think a lot of countries in the world that presently think that they're going to be able to continue to hedge as the U.S.-China relationship deteriorates, particularly around data and technology and 5G and the Internet of Things, are going to find out they can't. When the U.S. left the Iranian nuclear deal just a couple of years ago, every American ally that was a co-signer of that deal opposed America leaving it, strongly and publicly opposed. And yet in 2020, you look at all of those countries, you look at Germany and France and the UK, you look at, sort of Japan as well, and you see that none of them are doing business with the Iranians anymore. Because even though they oppose the U.S. pulling out, if they have to choose between the U.S. and Iran, and the U.S. dollar as reserve currency and the U.S. banking system, the ability of the Americans to weaponize those transactions and sanction them, well, obviously American power matters a lot more. And ultimately, those decisions will also be made by advanced industrial economies that are thinking about aligning their technology and surveillance and data systems and cyber systems towards the U.S. or towards China.
I can't agree with you more. I think that the idea that you're going to be able to hedge your relationship between the U.S. and China, between the East and the West in development of technology, but in so many different aspects, is absolutely going to become more stark in the future. One of the ways we like to talk about that is that in one sense you have the death of oil, right? The death of fossil fuels and the rise of data as the new oil. And they are so different, the East and West, that alone is going to cause the ability to hedge to go away. So you've got this concept of tech infrastructure, right? There's going to be a U.S. and a China standard. Let's think about what that means for China. They've tried over the course of the last 20 years, but especially and aggressively in the last 10, to provide very inexpensive funding for countries to buy their infrastructure, whether it's poles and wires, but it now is all repeaters and towers. They've done that through cheap funding. They've built the ports. They've built the trains and the tracks. And they've done that to build the relationships that would allow them access to those markets. Now, when we look at what's taking place, as Ian just talked about, whether it's in India or Australia, Europe, and the United States, we're talking about basically a coming together of countries that want to maintain certain standards and can't, therefore, rely on a lot of the Chinese technology and are certainly not needing to buy the infrastructure. And so you're not going to be able to hedge. And we're going to see that happen in the equity markets, where you're going to see the development of what we call G2, which is a competitive company of one or more in each market, which are going to be competing large, but they're going to be doing it on different standards. You'll be able to invest in both if you're an investor, and that's a good thing, but you're not going to be able to actually buy from both if you're actually going to be taking parts and making things, or if you're going to be building entire ecosystems with the purchases.
So both of you spoke a bit about the developing world in terms of the effects that this competition would have. What are the sort of ultimate positive and negative impacts that this will have on the developing world?
For the developing world, it's pretty clear that you'd rather have competition for investment, competition for your data provider. It's going to get you better service, going to get you a better return. When I travel to places like Nigeria and Ethiopia, India, and you see that there are a bunch of local leaders that recognize that the United States isn't interested in providing the level of external investment that the Chinese are. The Europeans aren't. The Japanese aren't. And if the Chinese are the only game in town for some of the poorest countries and some of the places that are most brownfield in terms of infrastructure, then the Chinese are going to be able to name their price. And it'll ultimately be in China's favor and not in the favor of these countries. You always, in the same way that in the United States, we have the sense that we'd be better served if tech companies were not nascent monopolists in the fields that they operate. And it's why antitrust has been an important component of a properly functioning free market system. Well, geopolitically, increasingly, there are a lot of places where you don't really have competition. And this decoupling in the tech space is actually going to exacerbate that problem for some of the world's poorest countries.
So, Ian, the concerns about data and Chinese surveillance aren't unique to President Trump, and they aren't even unique to the United States. We just saw a ban on Huawei in the UK, for example, for similar reasons. So how do concerns about cybersecurity play into this?
Again, if you have to choose and you have the luxury of not worrying about broader trade issues, where capital's coming from, how much you're spending, your concerns will be more about China than they will the United States. That's pretty clear. And yet, if you ask any of these country leaders, who would you trust more, the United States or China? It's not remotely close. I mean, the U.S., the private sector does dominate these issues. There is rule of law. There is accountability, however imperfect. And that's just not true in authoritarian and state capitalist China. But it's not just about that. Chinese 5G is cheaper. They've rolled it out faster. I mean, you even have farmers in rural areas of Alabama in the United States that got angry when the U.S. government said you can't use Huawei because, frankly, they didn't have any money to do anything else. It was going to be costly for them. And so if Alabama farmers are saying it, I mean, you imagine what they're saying in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, right? So I do think that these are complicated conversations. In some countries, the conversations are going to be driven much more by commercial factors. The wealthier you get, the more they tend to also include questions of alignment of values, common interests in international organizations and the like.
I think that we're seeing in the election an extraordinary vulnerability that the West has because of the technology that it uses, because of how open it is, and because of how it can be exploited by China and the Russia for propaganda purposes. So while we think about Western technology as advantageous, and it also is quite vulnerable, that's going to create, of course, industrial opportunities to make it safer. But there's a difference between the trust that one has in the US or the West and in China, where I couldn't agree more with Ian. So let's think about what that means. Over the next 10 years, and I just bought a new washer dryer, and both my washer and my dryer are Wi-Fi connected. And whether the Chinese watch them or not doesn't matter. But all of the sensitive assets that one has in the future are going to be part of the Internet of Things. Now, when we think about that, that means the self-driving car, right, can be actually attacked. It can be hacked. The drones that will deliver packages can be hacked. The individual devices in our homes could theoretically be weaponized to be able to turn a thermostat into a listening device. And I could go on, and I used to think these things were small, and it turns out that all of them are risks, and all of them are more risks for the West than for China and its allies. So I think that we're at a stage where this issue of the systems and security are going to become ever larger. And I think that's going to be a major policy and economic struggle, for decades to come.
So Ian and David, everything today is, of course, colored by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the two of you have had a chance to talk about this very topic at a couple of different points in this pandemic. In general, do you think the U.S.-China relationship has worsened over the course of the pandemic? Has it gotten better? Even in just, the first 9 months of this year, there's been lots of change. So what have you seen in the U.S.-China relationship over this period?
Oh, it's very clearly gotten worse. The United States is blaming China for the original sin of the pandemic, for the cover-up for the first 4 weeks when they weren't telling the World Health Organization, that when they weren't sharing information internationally or with their own people. There's truth to that, but it hasn't led to more cooperation between the two countries. It's led to mutual recrimination. Chinese social media presence, official government social media presence, has become much more hostile towards the United States publicly, and there's also been more willingness to intervene and delegitimize U.S. institutions as well as the election, which in 2016 the Chinese really weren't doing. It was mostly about Russia and a little bit of Iran. There's no question that the fact that this has caused a lot of economic damage, both in China, which is going to have flat growth this year, and in the United States, the fact that President Trump is looking for someone to blame, and the fact that Xi Jinping internationally has a lot of fights on his hands, both of those things have created a much more dangerous relationship between the two. And, when you start thinking about next year and the fact that we desperately need a vaccine or vaccines that work to respond to this truly global virus, truly global pandemic, and you realize that the Americans and Chinese are cooperating not one whit on this issue, that tells you really all you need to know.
Absolutely. Technology has been accelerated, right, in terms of its use, in terms of its value, and deglobalization has been radically accelerated by this. The other thing that we've seen, what's been remarkable, is how their economies have actually both recovered incredibly well, given the amount of impact. So, there are 4 industries in both countries that have been completely hammered: travel, including, flight, obviously, and hotels, education, any social gathering, industries, healthcare, all have been deeply impacted, and obviously anything to do with retail and restaurants, both countries. China shuts down its industry. 88% of its economy comes back. Consumer spending comes back. They have the ability to make production come back. It's come back faster there. Then 3 months later, crisis hits the U.S. The U.S. manages the healthcare crisis, as I mentioned, very poorly. The economy comes back. 88% of it recovers. Same exact impacts. And what you see is, look at how incredibly resilient the Chinese economy is. It's as resilient and as strong as the U.S. economy. It's a perfect, almost a mirror image of one another, and it speaks to what Ian talked about at the beginning, this sort of equality, if you will, the fact that they're 2 superpowers with 2 super economies, and both have the ability to recover because of very different circumstances and policies, but because of the essential nature of their economies, their consumer economies.
David, how do you discuss decoupling with your clients? What kind of advice or guidance do you give investors on this issue?
We've touched upon this today in a variety of different ways. But when you're investing, you want to have as much information as you can and believe that the circumstances under which you're deriving that information are going to stay constant. So that certainly is not the case under President Trump and would be under his coming administration, but it might very well become the case in the event that President Biden were to be elected. So what we've been talking a lot about from an investment standpoint is, even though the idea of a full global economy with a set of rules would have been arguably the most optimal, what we're telling our investors now is that they should think about building portfolios that are, as I mentioned earlier, G2, where they have exposure in both markets, an East and West market, in almost all of the major industries. Number one, it could actually create portfolios that are more diverse and less volatile because the economies will not necessarily operate in a synchronous way. Second of all, the dominant countries, the dominant players in each of these markets could turn out to be profitable, have incredible growth prospects, and generate the kind of stock market returns you've seen in both economies. And lastly, you will actually get the benefit of identification of leaders because you'll be able to compare 2 different leading companies in the same industry across 2 different markets. And you'll understand, and Ian's made this point very well, that you're going to get 2 different types of 5G, 2 different evolutions of the next generation of everything. And so for us as investors, this is actually a very ripe environment. Now, the East, where China sits physically, has been an unstoppable trend that we've talked about at Citi Private Bank for quite some time. The whole region, the demographics of it, its relative ability to leapfrog because it doesn't have existing infrastructure to replace and to use the latest technology. The idea of onshoring, of building plants that manufacture things closer and closer to the customer. It will benefit from all of that much more greatly than any other part of the world. And China sits obviously adjacent to all of it. So that advantage goes to them. But in my mind, if you're investing, this is going to be an incredible opportunity.
David, Ian, thanks very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Living Beyond Borders. Stay with us throughout the fall as we look at the biggest issues impacting your world and your money. Next time, the future of cities in a post-pandemic world. I'm Caitlin Dean. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.